7 weeks before our wedding, I heard my fiancé laughing about me to his friends. 10 minutes later, I canceled the wedding in front of all of them. My name is Natalie Harper. I'm 32 years old, and 7 weeks before my wedding, I found out what my fiancé sounded like when he thought I wasn't listening. At the time, I didn't realize that was the beginning of the end. If you'd asked me then, I probably would have told you we were just dealing with normal wedding stress. Everyone says engaged couples argue more. Everyone says people get overwhelmed. I wanted to believe that was all it was. Ryan and I had been together for 4 years and engaged for 8 months. The wedding was already planned. The venue was booked. Invitations had gone out. Our families were counting down the weeks. We weren't talking about whether we'd get married anymore. We were talking about table assignments and flower arrangements and whether Ryan's uncle would behave himself after 2 glasses of wine. From the outside, we looked fine. Nothing felt wrong enough to argue about. That was the problem. Every uncomfortable moment seemed small by itself, easy to dismiss, easy to explain away. That's exactly what I did. About 3 months before the wedding, Ryan started taking yoga classes. At first, it was honestly funny. Ryan hated stretching. Watching him attempt yoga was like watching a folding chair try to become a gymnast. He'd come home sore and complain about muscles he didn't know existed. Then he got really into it. The yoga mat got upgraded. Then the water bottle. Then the smoothie recipes. Then the podcasts. I teased him relentlessly. "You're in a cult." He grinned. "If the cult comes with smoothies, I'm staying." Back then, we still laughed easily. Back then, nothing felt dangerous. Then, a new name started showing up in conversation. Chloe. At first, it was random. Chloe recommended this place. Chloe said that instructor is amazing. Chloe sent me a podcast. The comments seemed harmless. People make friends. I had male coworkers. Ryan had female friends. It wasn't the existence of Chloe that bothered me. It was how often she suddenly existed. One evening, I was making dinner while Ryan sat on the kitchen counter scrolling through his phone. I remember the moment clearly because it felt so ordinary. I was chopping peppers. He kept glancing down at his phone, smiling to himself as the conversation continued. Every few seconds, another message appeared, and his attention drifted right back to the screen. I glanced up. "Who keeps making you smile like that?" "Chloe." The answer came so quickly that I didn't think much about it at the time. I just went back to cooking. But over the next few weeks, little things kept piling up. Coffee after yoga, long conversations after class, texts late at night, texts early in the morning, texts while we were eating dinner together, texts while we watched movies. None of those things sounded serious individually. That was the problem. Every single piece was easy to explain away. I kept telling myself that. Then one night I finally said something. Not an accusation, not an argument, just a conversation. Ryan was on the couch watching television when I sat down beside him. "Can I ask you something?" He muted the television. "Sure." I hesitated longer than I should have. Even now, looking back, I remember feeling nervous before I'd said a single word. "Do you think you've been spending a lot of time with Chloe lately?" His expression changed immediately. That surprised me. Not because he looked guilty, because he looked irritated. "What does that mean?" The question instantly put me on defense. I remember fumbling for words. "I don't know. It just feels like she's become a pretty big part of your life." Ryan let out a slow breath. "Natalie, seriously?" "I'm just asking." "She's my friend." "I know." "Then what's the issue?" I could already feel the conversation slipping away from what I'd actually meant. "There isn't an issue." "Sounds like there is." By the end of that conversation, I somehow found myself apologizing. I remember lying awake that night staring at the ceiling, replaying every word. Maybe I had overreacted. Maybe wedding planning was getting to me. Maybe I was becoming insecure. The uncomfortable feeling didn't disappear, but I stopped bringing it up. Life moved forward. Or at least it looked like it did. Ryan kept mentioning Chloe. I kept pretending it didn't bother me. And every time that uncomfortable feeling surfaced, I pushed it back down because I didn't want to be the jealous fiancé. Weeks passed like that. Then came the brunch. Ryan invited 3 of his closest friends over to help with wedding planning. The apartment looked like a Pinterest board had exploded across our dining room. Color samples, guest lists, champagne glasses, flower catalogs. I volunteered to make breakfast mostly because I needed an excuse to stay busy. The morning felt normal. That's what I remember most. The smell of coffee, bacon sizzling in the pan, the low hum of conversation drifting in from the dining room. For a while, I wasn't paying attention to what they were saying. Then I heard one of Ryan's friends ask a question. "So what's actually going on with Chloe?" A few people laughed. I paused without really meaning to. Another friend spoke. "Seriously, Natalie seems pretty bothered by it." More laughter. Then Ryan answered. "Oh my God, she's so bothered." The way he said it caught me off guard. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't frustrated. It sounded amused, like they were sharing an inside joke. Someone asked why I cared so much. Ryan didn't hesitate. Because she has trust issues. More laughter. I stood there holding a spatula while breakfast continued cooking in front of me. The conversation kept moving. Nobody sounded uncomfortable. Nobody sounded awkward. Nobody sounded like they were saying something they shouldn't. That was the part I couldn't stop thinking about later. They were comfortable. One friend joked about controlling partners. Another called my behavior a red flag. Ryan agreed. Then he said something I can still hear perfectly. I swear sometimes being engaged to Natalie is exhausting. The table erupted. Everyone laughed. Ryan laughed too. For a few seconds, I just stood there listening. I kept expecting the conversation to correct itself somehow. I kept expecting someone to say I was being treated unfairly. I kept expecting Ryan to defend me. Instead, the conversation continued. The eggs started burning. Nobody noticed, including me. I turned off the stove, set down the spatula, and walked toward the dining room. The second I stepped into the doorway, the entire mood shifted. Ryan looked up first. His smile disappeared so fast it almost looked painful. One of his friends suddenly became very interested in her champagne glass. Another stared at the table. Nobody spoke. Then Ryan cleared his throat. "Hey, babe." The sweetness in his voice hadn't existed 30 seconds earlier. "We were just talking about flowers." I looked around the room. The flower samples. The wedding magazines. The people who had been laughing about me moments before. Then I looked back at Ryan. "No," I said quietly. "You weren't." For a moment, nobody moved. The room still looked exactly the same. The wedding magazines were still spread across the table. Half-finished mimosas still sat beside centerpiece samples. Sunlight still poured through the apartment windows. Yet somehow everything felt different. Ryan shifted in his chair. "What are you talking about?" I pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. Looking back, what stands out isn't how angry I was. It's how calm I was. That should have been the moment I started yelling. It would have made sense if I had. Instead, I felt strangely detached, as though part of me had already accepted something before the rest of me caught up. I heard the conversation. Nobody rushed to deny it. Nobody looked confused. Nobody asked what conversation. That silence answered more than any explanation could have. Ryan rubbed the back of his neck. "Babe, come on." "No," I said. "Actually, I wanted to thank you." The confusion around the table was immediate. One of his friends frowned. Ryan looked relieved. The relief almost made me sad. For a second, he genuinely thought I was about to smooth everything over. "Thank me?" he asked. "Yeah." I folded my hands on the table. "You were right." Ryan's shoulders relaxed. "Exactly. All of you were right." The confidence returned to his face. "That's what I've been trying to tell you." I nodded slowly. "You're right, I'm insecure." A couple of his friends exchanged satisfied looks. "I'm exhausting." Nobody interrupted. "I have trust issues." Ryan leaned back. "See?" The room was still waiting for me to agree with them completely. Nobody had realized where the conversation was going. Not yet. I looked directly at Ryan. "I mean, why would someone like you want to marry a woman like that?" His expression changed instantly. "What? You shouldn't." "Natalie." "No, seriously." I stood up. "If everything you said is true, then this wedding is a terrible idea." Now people were starting to understand. The smiles disappeared first. Then the confidence. Ryan rose from his chair. "Okay, let's stop for a second." "Why?" "Because you're upset." That almost made me laugh. An hour earlier, my feelings had been a joke. Now suddenly they mattered. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. Ryan watched me carefully. "What are you doing?" "You'll see." I opened my contacts and found the wedding venue. The manager answered after a couple of rings. "Oakwood Gardens. This is Melissa." "Hi, this is Natalie Harper. I'm calling about our October wedding reservation." The room became completely still. Ryan took a step toward me. "Natalie." I held up a finger while the manager pulled up the reservation. "How can I help you today? I need to cancel it." The reaction was immediate. "What?" Ryan actually lurched forward. "Natalie, stop!" One of his friends nearly knocked over her glass. Another stared at me as if I'd suddenly become someone she didn't recognize. Meanwhile, the manager calmly explained the cancellation policy. "As outlined in your contract, cancellations within 60 days result in forfeiture of the full deposit." "I understand." Ryan looked panicked. Not shocked, not hurt, panicked. There was a difference. "Natalie, hang up." I ignored him. "Can you remind me of the deposit amount?" The manager checked. $8,200. The number seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. Ryan's face lost all color. "Please proceed with the cancellation." For a second, nobody spoke. Then Ryan exploded. "Are you out of your mind?" The manager confirmed everything, promised to send the paperwork, and ended the call. I slipped the phone back into my purse. Ryan stared at me. "You just canceled our wedding." "No." "What?" "I canceled my wedding." His jaw tightened. "Natalie, don't do this." "Don't do what?" "This." He gestured around the room. "The drama, the scene, whatever this is." That word stuck with me. Drama, not humiliation, not betrayal, not hurt. Drama. As though the real problem wasn't what had happened. The real problem was that I wasn't quietly accepting it. You spent months telling me I was overreacting, I said. Because you were. Really? Yes. His answer came so quickly that several people around the table looked uncomfortable. One of his friends suddenly found the flower catalog fascinating. Another wouldn't meet my eyes. Ryan kept talking. You heard one conversation and now you're destroying everything. I looked at him. Part of me still wanted him to say the right thing. Not the perfect thing. Just the honest thing. Instead, he kept defending himself. Not once did he say he was sorry. Not once did he acknowledge what I'd actually heard. Not once did he say I didn't deserve it. You know what hurts? I asked. Ryan crossed his arms. What? I kept waiting for you. His expression flickered. Waiting for me to what? Say something. Nobody moved. When they called me controlling, I waited. Ryan looked away. When they joked about me being insecure, I waited. The room felt smaller somehow. When they laughed at me, I still thought eventually you'd step in and defend me. Ryan's friends looked miserable now. Good. They should have. Because this wasn't some misunderstanding. Everybody in that room knew exactly what had happened. Ryan dragged a hand through his hair. You're blowing this way out of proportion. There it was. The familiar script. The same one we'd followed for months. I feel uncomfortable. Ryan tells me I'm overreacting. I apologize. Everything returns to normal. Except this time the ending was different. Because I wasn't apologizing. I picked up my purse. Ryan followed immediately. Where are you going? Away. Natalie, come on. I can't do this right now. His voice softened. That caught me off guard because it sounded genuine for the first time all morning. We can talk about this. I looked at him. 4 years together. 8 months engaged. Countless plans. Countless conversations about the future. And standing there in front of him, I realized I had no idea whether he actually understood why I was leaving. Maybe he thought I was angry. Maybe he thought I needed space. Maybe he thought I'd cool off and come back. The truth was simpler than that. Something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't walking out because I wanted to punish him. I was walking out because I suddenly couldn't picture myself standing at the end of an aisle pretending none of this had happened. I'll come back for my things later. Ryan stared at me. Natalie. I paused at the doorway. If being engaged to me is really that exhausting, you don't have to worry about it anymore. Then I left. The calls started before I reached my car. Ryan. Then Ryan again. Then Ryan again. By the time I got to a hotel across town, I'd already missed 12 calls. That number would be over 200 before the week was over. At the time, though, I wasn't thinking about any of that. I was sitting alone on the edge of a hotel bed, staring at my engagement ring under the lamplight, wondering how a wedding that had felt so certain 24 hours earlier could suddenly feel impossible. And somewhere between the 15th missed call and the 20th, a thought kept circling in the back of my mind. Not about Ryan. Not about the wedding. About Chloe. Because for months, I'd been convinced Chloe was the center of every argument. Now I wasn't so sure anymore. I didn't answer Ryan's calls that night, or the next morning, or the morning after that. At first, the messages sounded frantic. Natalie, please call me. Let's talk. This isn't how we solve things. Then frustration started creeping in. You're seriously ending everything over this? Can you at least act like an adult? A few hours later, the tone softened again. I miss you. Please come home. Every message sounded different, but they all wanted the same thing, a response. Every message seemed designed to find the combination that would make me respond. The strange thing was that a month earlier, it probably would have worked. I would have answered. I would have listened. I would have tried to fix things. Now I just set the phone down and went about my day. 3 days after I left, I received a call from the front desk at work. Natalie, there's someone here asking for you. I already knew who it was. Ryan. A brief pause. Yes. I closed my eyes. Of course. Apparently 200 unanswered calls weren't enough. I took the elevator down. Ryan was standing near the lobby windows. He looked exhausted. His shirt was wrinkled. His eyes were bloodshot. The sight of him hit me harder than I expected. Not because I wanted to run into his arms. Because for a second I remembered how many times I'd been the person who comforted him. Old habits don't disappear overnight. Natalie. Relief flooded across his face. Thank God. What are you doing here? You wouldn't answer me. Several people were pretending not to watch us. Pretending badly. Ryan glanced around. Can we go somewhere private? Part of me wanted to say no. Instead, I pointed toward a coffee shop across the street. 10 minutes. The second we sat down, Ryan started talking. Not listening. Talking. There was a difference. I've barely slept. I said nothing. I've been trying to reach you. Still nothing. You canceled the venue. There it was. Not I hurt you. I'm sorry. The venue. The wedding. The logistics. Ryan leaned forward. Do you realize what this looks like? I stared at him. To who? Everybody. I waited. Family, friends, people are asking questions. For a moment, I almost felt embarrassed for him, because he genuinely thought public perception was the crisis. Meanwhile, I was still thinking about what he'd said at brunch. Ryan. What? Do you actually understand why I left? Because you're upset. The answer came so fast that I knew he'd never really thought about it. I'm upset because of what happened. Exactly. No. I shook my head. That's not the same thing. His frustration surfaced immediately. Natalie, everybody vents. There was that word again. Vents. As if everything became harmless once it received the correct label. I stirred my coffee. You weren't venting. Yes, I was. No. Ryan frowned. Then what was I doing? I looked out the window for a second. People moved along the sidewalk carrying shopping bags and coffees and grocery sacks. Ordinary lives continuing. Then I looked back at him. You were comfortable. Ryan didn't answer. For the first time since sitting down, he genuinely seemed unsure what to say. I continued. You weren't defending yourself in that room. You weren't frustrated. You were having fun. His eyes dropped briefly to the table. Neither of us spoke for a few seconds. Not because it was some dramatic movie moment. Because there wasn't an easy response. Eventually, Ryan exhaled. Okay. That surprised me. Okay. Maybe I went too far. Maybe. The word landed heavily between us. Months together. A canceled wedding. A destroyed relationship. And we were at maybe. I suddenly understood why none of this felt fixable. It wasn't because he'd made a mistake. Everybody makes mistakes. It was because he still seemed more interested in reducing the size of the mistake than understanding it. Then something occurred to me. A question I hadn't asked. Have you talked to Chloe? Ryan blinked. What? Since all this happened? He looked genuinely confused by the question. Not really. That wasn't the answer I expected. Not really? He shrugged. I mean, a little. Why? I sat back. For months, Chloe had been at the center of every disagreement we'd had. Her name had shown up in almost every argument. Every uncomfortable conversation somehow circled back to her. Yet sitting there across from Ryan, I realized something strange. Chloe wasn't sitting in this coffee shop. Chloe wasn't sending hundreds of messages. Chloe wasn't demanding explanations. Chloe wasn't the reason I couldn't look at my fiancé the same way. The entire time I'd been focusing on the wrong person. For months, I'd treated Chloe like the center of the story. Sitting across from Ryan, I wasn't so sure anymore. Ryan watched my expression carefully. What? Nothing. But it wasn't nothing. I found myself looking down at my coffee instead of answering. For months, I'd been looking at Chloe every time something felt wrong. That suddenly seemed less important. The conversation lasted another 20 minutes. Ryan tried apologies. Then explanations. Then promises. Counseling came up. Communication came up. Second chances came up. By the end, it felt less like a conversation and more like a negotiation. As if we were discussing terms instead of a relationship. Eventually, I stood. Ryan followed. So that's it? I picked up my purse. I don't know. His face tightened. You don't know? I know the wedding isn't happening. The words hung between us. Ryan looked away. For the first time all afternoon, he seemed genuinely affected. Not defensive. Not argumentative. Just tired. So was I. As I started toward the door, Ryan called my name. I turned back. For a second, I thought he might finally say the thing I'd been waiting to hear. Instead, he asked, Do you realize how much money we're losing? I stood there staring at him. Then I left without answering. Outside, the late afternoon traffic crawled through the intersection. People crossed the street carrying groceries. A bus hissed to send a stop. Life moved forward as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, Ryan was still counting deposits. And I finally understood that we weren't standing in the same story anymore. After the coffee shop meeting, I stopped expecting a breakthrough. That probably sounds obvious now, but at the time, I still had a small part of me holding on to the idea that eventually Ryan would understand why everything had fallen apart. Maybe not immediately, maybe not while he was angry, but eventually. I thought there would come a moment when he'd look back at that brunch and see it the way I saw it. I kept waiting for that moment. It never came. A few days later, an email landed in my inbox from a lawyer I'd never heard of. The subject line included the phrase, formal demand. I opened it expecting something serious. Instead, it read like someone had tried to turn a breakup into a business dispute. According to the letter, I had caused financial damages by canceling wedding contracts without Ryan's approval. The attorney demanded reimbursement for Ryan's share of the lost deposits and suggested legal action if we couldn't reach an agreement. I read it twice. Then I forwarded it to my cousin Emma. Emma had been practicing law for nearly 10 years. Unlike the person who wrote that email, 10 minutes later my phone rang. I answered. Please tell me you're not panicking. I immediately knew she had read it. Should I be? Emma laughed. Not a polite laugh. The kind of laugh people make when they genuinely can't believe something exists. Natalie, this is ridiculous. So I'm not being sued? No. Not even close? Not even remotely close. I could still hear the amusement in her voice. Natalie, whoever wrote this is hoping you panic and send money. So he has no case? Let's just say I'd love to watch him explain this argument in front of a judge. I sank back into my chair. For the first time all day, I smiled. Emma explained why the letter was mostly intimidation and very little substance. By the time we hung up, I felt better. That feeling lasted until Ryan's parents got involved. My mother called that evening. The second I answered, I could tell she'd already spoken to someone. Ryan's father called. Of course he did. I sat down at my kitchen table. And? Mom hesitated. He says you've taken money from Ryan. I stared at the wall for a second. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so wildly disconnected from reality that I didn't know what else to do. For the next half hour, I explained everything. The brunch, the cancellation, the deposits, the lawyer's letter, the coffee shop conversation. When I finished, my mother was quiet. Then she asked a question. Did he ever apologize? I thought about it. Every phone call, every text, every meeting, every argument, every explanation. The answer came surprisingly fast. No, Mom sighed. That's what I thought. A day later, she called again. Apparently, she'd spoken directly with Ryan's mother. I didn't ask for details. My mother volunteered them anyway. She kept saying everyone says things they don't mean. I already knew where this was going. What did you say? I asked her whether she'd be comfortable hearing her husband talk about her that way in front of his friends. That ended the conversation. The topic changed immediately. My mother sounded almost impressed. I couldn't blame her, because that was what kept getting lost in every discussion. Everyone wanted to talk about the canceled wedding. Very few people wanted to talk about what caused it. Over the following week, mutual friends started reaching out. Some were genuinely concerned. Others seemed determined to negotiate on Ryan's behalf. One friend called during my lunch break. I think you're both hurting. That was probably true. I think you're right. And I think maybe neither of you is seeing the other person's side. That was where we disagreed. Not because Ryan wasn't hurting. He clearly was. I just didn't think his pain erased what had happened. People kept acting as though acknowledging Ryan's feelings required ignoring mine. I wasn't willing to do that anymore. The strangest conversations came from people who barely knew the situation. Friends of friends. Distant relatives. People who had heard a simplified version and somehow felt qualified to offer advice. One woman sent me a 3-page message explaining why successful marriages require forgiveness. Another insisted wedding stress changes people. Someone else suggested I was making a permanent decision based on temporary emotions. I read exactly 2 of those messages before deleting the rest. Not out of anger, mostly exhaustion. I was tired of being treated like someone who hadn't thought carefully about her own life. Then, about 2 weeks after leaving the apartment, I went back to pick up the rest of my things. The moment I walked inside, something felt different. The place looked half empty. Boxes lined the hallway. Several shelves had been cleared. The dining table where we'd planned the wedding looked strangely small, without everything covering it. I stood there for a moment taking it in. Then I heard movement from the bedroom. Ryan appeared a few seconds later. Neither of us had known the other would be there. For a brief moment, we simply stared at each other. He looked tired. Not dramatically tired. Not movie scene tired. Just worn down. The way people look after weeks of bad sleep and too much thinking. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "I came for the rest of my stuff." He nodded. "Right." The awkwardness settled immediately. Not hostile. Just unfamiliar. Like 2 people trying to navigate a space that used to belong to both of them. I walked toward the bedroom. Most of my things were already gathered together. Ryan had apparently separated them from everything else. I appreciated that more than I expected. For several minutes, we packed in silence. Not dramatic silence. Just the practical kind that happens when 2 people don't know what to say. Eventually, Ryan spoke. "You know, everybody thinks I'm the bad guy." I kept folding clothes. I haven't exactly been conducting a press tour. His jaw tightened. "That's not what I mean." I looked up. Ryan leaned against the dresser. For the first time since the breakup, he didn't seem angry. He seemed frustrated. With himself. With me. With the situation. Maybe with all 3. I made a stupid joke. I didn't respond. It got out of hand. Still nothing. Because that wasn't what happened. And deep down, I think he knew it. And that was what made it difficult. If Ryan had been some cartoon villain, this would have been easier. But he wasn't. He was a person who had convinced himself that the relationship ended because of my reaction, not because of his behavior. That's a much harder problem to solve. Because you can't argue someone out of a story they've already chosen to believe. I zipped my suitcase. Ryan watched me. For a second, it looked like he wanted to say something else. Instead, he stepped aside and let me pass. I carried the suitcase into the hallway. When I reached the front door, I glanced back. Ryan was standing exactly where I'd left him, surrounded by half-packed boxes, looking at a room that no longer resembled the future we'd spent years planning. Neither of us spoke. Then I left. And for the first time since canceling the wedding, I had the feeling that there might not be another conversation after all. A few days passed after that, then a week, then another. The constant calls stopped. The texts became less frequent. Even the mutual friends who had been trying to broker peace between us seemed to run out of energy. Life didn't suddenly become easier, but it became quieter. That quiet gave me space to notice things I hadn't been able to hear before. The first thing I noticed was how much of my daily routine had revolved around managing Ryan's moods. Not in some dramatic way, in small ways, the kind that don't stand out while you're living them. I stopped checking my phone before bed to see whether he'd responded to something. I stopped rehearsing difficult conversations in my head during my commute. I stopped wondering whether bringing up a concern would somehow turn into an argument about my reaction instead of the actual issue. Those changes weren't exciting. Nobody would make a movie about them, but they were real, and real changes tend to happen quietly. About 3 weeks after moving out, I received another message from Ryan. Unlike the dozens before it, this one was short. Can we meet one more time? I stared at it for a while. Then I agreed. Not because I expected reconciliation. Mostly because I didn't want unfinished business lingering indefinitely. We met at a small restaurant halfway between our neighborhoods. The same kind of casual place where nobody pays attention to the people sitting at the next table. Ryan was already there when I arrived. For a second, I barely recognized him. Not physically. Something else. The urgency that had been driving him for weeks seemed gone. He looked calmer. Older somehow. Like someone who'd finally run out of arguments. When I sat down, neither of us rushed into conversation. The waiter brought water. We ordered food. For a few minutes, we talked about practical things. The remaining lease paperwork. A couple of utility accounts. Some furniture neither of us wanted. Ordinary topics. The kind divorced couples probably discuss every day. Eventually, Ryan leaned back. I talked to Chloe. The comment caught me off guard. Not because I hadn't thought about her. Because I hadn't thought about her in weeks. Oh? He nodded. She asked what happened. I waited. Ryan looked down at his glass. I told her. And? A small smile appeared. Not a happy smile. The kind people make when they don't particularly enjoy the answer they're about to give. She said if her boyfriend talked about her the way I talked about you, she'd leave too. Ryan let out a short breath. She was actually annoyed that people assumed she was the reason we broke up. That caught me off guard. What did she say? He looked down at his glass. She said she barely knew me before yoga. According to her, if our relationship collapsed because of one brunch conversation, then the problem wasn't her. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Ryan added quietly, she told me I was looking in the wrong direction if I wanted someone to blame. I looked at him for a moment, then down at the table, then back at him. Of all the things I expected to hear that evening, that wasn't one of them. Ryan shook his head. I don't know why that hit me. I did. Sometimes the people closest to a situation become part of it. Everybody picks a side. Everybody has opinions. Then someone outside the emotional chaos says one simple thing, and suddenly the situation looks different. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. Then Ryan surprised me again. I'm not saying that changes anything. I raised an eyebrow. No? No. He looked tired. Honest, but tired. I think I spent a long time convincing myself this happened because you overreacted. The words came out slowly. Not rehearsed. Not polished. Just uncomfortable. And eventually, I ran out of people willing to agree with me. I looked away before he could see my reaction. Not because I was emotional. Because after everything that had happened, that statement felt strangely human. Not dramatic. Not profound. Just human. The food arrived. The conversation drifted. For the first time since the breakup, we talked without trying to win. Without trying to convince. Without trying to rewrite anything. That didn't magically fix the damage. It didn't make me reconsider. It didn't bring the wedding back. But it was probably the most honest conversation we'd had in months. When dinner ended, Ryan walked me to my car. The evening air was cool. Traffic moved steadily through the intersection nearby. For a moment, we stood there awkwardly. Neither of us seemed sure what the appropriate ending was. Finally, Ryan spoke. I'm sorry. The words were simple. No explanation attached. No defense. No conditions. Just the apology. I looked at him. Part of me had wanted to hear those words for weeks. Now that they were finally there, they didn't change very much. Not because they weren't sincere, because some things arrive after the decision has already been made. I know. Ryan nodded. Then he stepped back. That was it. No dramatic goodbye. No last-minute confession. No desperate attempt to get me back. Just two people standing in a parking lot after the end of a relationship. As I drove home, I realized I wasn't replaying the conversation. A month earlier, I would have analyzed every sentence. Now I just drove. The city lights slid across the windshield. The radio played softly in the background. And for the first time in a long while, my mind felt quiet. A few weeks later, the lease officially ended. The last paperwork was signed. The final accounts were closed. The remaining boxes were sorted. The practical parts of the breakup finally caught up with the emotional parts. Then, one Saturday morning, I carried the last box into my new apartment. The movers had already left. Most of the furniture was in place. The living room still looked unfinished. A couple of boxes sat near the hallway waiting to be unpacked. My father had helped me hang shelves the previous weekend. My sister had insisted on buying a ridiculous housewarming plant that was somehow still alive. The place was slowly becoming mine. I set the box on the floor and looked around. The apartment wasn't large. It wasn't particularly impressive, but it felt peaceful. And after the previous few months, peaceful felt surprisingly valuable. The sun was coming through the balcony doors. Somewhere outside, a dog barked. A neighbor was dragging groceries down the hallway. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary Saturday morning sounds. I opened one of the last boxes and found an old photo tucked between books. Ryan and I were standing on a beach from years earlier, both sunburned, both smiling. I looked at it for a few seconds, then slid it into a drawer. I closed the drawer, carried a coffee mug onto the balcony, and settled into the chair I'd assembled the night before. Down below, people were walking dogs, carrying grocery bags, heading somewhere on a perfectly ordinary morning. My phone buzzed on the table. "Dinner tonight?" my sister texted. I typed back. "Sounds good." Down below, a little girl ran across the parking lot while her father followed behind carrying grocery bags. She laughed at something. He laughed too. The sound drifted upward with the afternoon breeze. I set my phone down, leaned back in the chair, and watched the balcony curtains move gently beside me.